Okay, hi everyone. Our project is about about sadomasochism. My name is Hera Boyd.
I'm Alexander Buchanan.
I'm Bailey Green.
And I'm Sydney Vang.
And let's jump right into the literature review. So my part of the project is specifically focused on sexual communication in kink, and the term kink or kinky is typically used interchangeably with BDSM or sadomasochism, and it is considered non-normative sexual behavior and has been traditionally stigmatized and pathologized. Regardless, though, kink and SM activities are characterized by explicit consent with or without the presence of sex. And then in terms of sexual communication, effective sexual communication is an essential factor in satisfaction sexually in a relationship. And for both male and female partners, disclosure about personal preferences regarding sex reported greater sexual satisfaction. And then individuals who reported feeling unsatisfied about sexual communication in their relationships also reported feelings of dissatisfaction with the entire sexual relationship. And then, so together I couldn't find much literature on like the two variables together, but explicit communication and mutual understanding are required in BDSM interactions, and kink and SM communities universally expect open communication, boundary setting, and establishment of needs. And then in addition, technology has been shown to disinhibit communication about kink and SM related topics by reducing the perception of threat.
And my part of the project is focused on just LGBTQ people and attitudes towards sadomasochism. In general, both sexuality was defined as based on moral and legal considerations rather than medical ones, which led to the pathologization of both communities by medical experts and it being determined as deviant. And sadomasochism is one of the three dyads within BDSM that is being bondage and discipline and dominance and submission. And sadomasochism is about the giving and receiving of pain. And in general, the rise of LGBTQ rights have also helped to benefit acceptance of attitudes towards sadomasochism communities. And a person is considered deviant, who is considered deviant, might be open to other deviant activities in society. And just for some statistics I found in a national survey in Australia, 2008, around 1.8% of people had participated in some sort of BDSM activity within the last year. And comparatively, there was a study in New York of lesbian and bisexual women, and like 43% of them had reported being engaged in the same type of behaviors within the same period. And some of the potential benefits of people in both communities is that people can find their sexuality or gender identity through some kind of BDSM or sadomasochism play. It's been a place of communities getting together, leather cultures, interacting between those two. And they can also provide open, safe spaces for people in both communities to be somewhere without judgment. And in general, interest in BDSM has not been found to be associated with life trauma.
Okay, so I did my part of the project on sexual kink and religiosity. And as we've mentioned, that sexual kink is a growing practice in our society, and religion has been a part of our society since the very beginning, which shapes people's beliefs and behaviors. And then here I just reiterated the definition of sexual kink that Hera covered earlier. Okay, and then I found that despite sexual kink being a popular topic in mainstream media, it continues to be stigmatized within our society. And this stigmatization is held by the general public as well as professionals and practitioners because they may see BDSM as harsh and unkind. As far as religious views on sex go, every religion has their own unique views, which can influence sexual practices by defining what is acceptable and unacceptable. However, a consistent theme throughout different denominations is that having children is considered a religious duty, and that kind of puts a purpose on having sex instead of just having sex for pleasure with your partner.
So a part of my research, I really focused on the attitudes as it relates to kink participation and depression. And I found that from Combs et al. 2006, they defined kink and BDSM with a more community-based definition, wherein it is a knowing use of psychological submission and dominance and or pain, bondage, and other related activities in a safe, legal, and consensual manner. Tanya et al. In 2012 found that kink-oriented individuals were being falsely diagnosed by the DSM as having sexual disorders and personality disorders, and were perceived to be sexual deviations within society. They also found that these same individuals were met with much discrimination and were targets of violence. Discrimination such as loss of security clearances, jobs, inheritances, and even child custody. Laska 2013 found that stigma is experienced from various sources, such as within the legal system, friends, family, healthcare communities, and from even within themselves. Eric et al. 2015 defined sexual stigma as a negative regard, inferior status, and relative powerlessness that society collectively accords anyone associated with non-heterosexual behaviors. They found that stigmas correlate reliably with psychological distress, wherein when you have higher self-stigma, that leads to lower self-esteem, which then causes a heightened, which is positively correlated with heightened psychological distress. Yates and or Colburn from 2019 found that myths regarding the kink community deemed these individuals to be emotionally unstable and very violent to others, wherein it reinforces the mainstream representations as a form of social control.
Now let's go into the hypotheses. So mine for sexual communication was that I hypothesized that there will be a positive correlation between attitudes about kink and sadomasochism and quality of dyadic sexual relationship.
Mine was that the LGBTQ sample group will have significantly more positive attitudes about sadomasochism when compared to the heterosexual participants.
My hypothesis is that there will be a negative correlation between religiosity and positive attitudes towards sexual kink.
And I hypothesized that participants who engage in kink and have more negative attitudes will score higher on the depression scale than those who engage in kink and have more positive attitudes, and pertaining to those who do not practice kink at all.
And then into our method section.
Okay, so we all used a total of 46 participants in our survey whose ages ranged from 18 to 54 years old. The majority of our participants were white or Caucasian, were female. They said that they had no religious affiliation. The majority of our sample sexually identified as heterosexual and said that they mostly participated in sexual behaviors with men. And then just a little over half of our participants said that yes, they do participate in kink or sadomasochism activities.
And our recruitment ad was posted on reddit.com. Participants were asked to consent. If they said yes, they continued. They were asked their age. If they were 18 or over, they were moved on to the demographic section, which Bailey covered. And after that, they were given the socially wrong category of the AASMS test. Then in random order, they encountered the dyadic sexual communication scale, the Center for Epidemiologic Studies depression scale, and the centrality religiosity scale.
And our materials.
The first one was the AASMS by Yost 2010. This is a 23-item survey, but we only used the socially wrong subscale, which was items 1 through 12. There was a 7-point Likert scale with basically the tendency was if you disagreed, the low scores were more positive attitudes towards sadomasochism. High scores were negative. These scores were averaged. None of them were reverse scored. And the convex alpha was a 0.95.
And then for sexual communication, I used the dyadic sexual communication scale. It's a 13-item survey used to measure the quality of dyadic sexual relationship, and I actually used 2 versions. The version used in the survey was a 5-point Likert scale, and the original version, which had the descriptive statistics, is a 6-point Likert type scale. Both you sum each item to calculate the score. And then the higher score on this scale indicates a better quality of dyadic sexual relationship. And then the Cronbach alpha for that one is 0.81.
Okay, I use the centrality of religiosity scale, which is a 15-item survey consisting of 5 subscales. However, I only used the ideology and intellect subscales for my presentation, and which totaled 6 items. It was scored by calculating a mean score, which could range from 1 to 5. No items were reverse scored, and then the groups were categorized as either non-religious, religious, or highly religious, depending on what they scored.
So I use the Center for Epidemiologic Studies depression scale. This scale consisted of 20 items on a 4-point Likert scale to measure frequency of depressive symptoms. It was scored from 0 to 4, with items 4, 8, 12, and 16 reverse scored. To calculate the score, you just sum each item, and a score over 16 indicated that the participant had a mental disorder or it may be present. And Cronbach's alpha for this scale was at a 0.91.
And our results.
With the AASMS, the totals ranged from a total of 1.0 to 5.92. Median of 1.99, standard deviation of 1.29, and the Cronbach's alpha was 0.95.
And then for the DSCS, participants' perceived level of sexual communication ranged from a sum total score of 28 to 57, with a mean of 49.22 and a standard deviation of 7.75. And then the Cronbach alpha we found for that was 0.82.
Okay, and for the CRS, the ideology subscale scores ranged from 1 to 5 with a mean of 2.30, and that subscale had a Cronbach's alpha of 0.93. And then for the intellect subscale, scores also ranged from 1 to 5 with a mean of 2.42, and that Cronbach's alpha is 0.83.
For the CESD, I found that participants' scores range from a total sum of 20 to 76, with a mean average of 42.37 and a standard deviation of 13.86. And I found Cronbach's alpha for this scale to be at a 0.94.
And then our hypothesis testing and exploratory analyses. For mine, again, I hypothesized that there would be a positive correlation between attitudes about kink and sadomasochism and quality of dyadic sexual relationship. And I did not find a statistically significant positive correlation between those two variables. And I also did not find anything significant when testing separately for gender, age, and kink participation, and all that information is listed on the slide.
For the LGBTQ part, participants were divided by self-reported sexuality according to the demographics. They were divided into 2 groups, the heterosexual made in one group, and everyone else was combined, including the gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, or other, into just the LGBTQ group. There was a significant difference with the LGBT group having more positive attitudes. And in exploratory testing, I looked at just attraction levels and the gender they had sex with the most, and none of those had any other significance to them.
Okay, just reiterating, my hypothesis was that there would be a negative correlation between religiosity and positive attitudes towards sexual kink. However, my results showed an insignificant, weak, positive correlation between the ideology subscale and positive attitudes towards sexual kink, while also showing an insignificant, weak, negative correlation between the intellect subscale and positive attitudes. Neither of these really supported my hypothesis because I did not find any strong significant correlations. As far as exploratory analyses go, I did test my hypotheses separately for males and females. And again, I did not find any strong significant correlations for either gender or either subscale.
For my research, I found that there was a weak, negative, non-significant correlation among participants who engaged in kink and had more positive or negative attitudes as it relates to depressive symptoms. and I found a moderate negative non-significant correlation among participants who did not participate in kink and had more positive or negative attitudes as it relates to depressive symptoms. So overall, my hypothesis was not supported because I did not find a significant or high correlation. For my exploratory analyses, I tested my hypothesis separately by gender and age. And I found that females exhibited a weak significant negative correlation, while males exhibited a weak insignificant negative correlation. When testing my hypothesis by age, I found that both emerging adults and adults showed a weak insignificant negative correlation.
And then into the discussion section. So again, I didn't find a significant relationship between AASM and QDSR, but attitudes about sadomasochism were positive overall. These findings did not support my hypothesis, but explicit communication and mutual understanding is a critical part of SM and kink activities. And attitudes about kink and SM is different than participating in kink and SM activities. So in terms of future research, it would be beneficial to examine specifically kink and sadomasochism participation, and then quality of dyadic sexual relationship to see if there's a relationship between those two variables specifically. And then since kink and SM is slowly being destigmatized within our culture, the overall positive attitudes do make sense. But in terms of future research, it could be beneficial to inquire about education and experience regarding kink and SM prior to completing the survey to examine the impact it might have on the overall attitudes about kink and SM. And then some limitations for my part was generalizability. We had a very small sample size, so we can't generalize it until further research is done with a larger sample size. And then for mine specifically, the DSCS measure was an incorrect version used. So the correct version of the scale should be used in future research to compare findings to previous research. And then applicability of findings in conclusion. I had hoped to find a connection between attitudes about sadomasochism and quality of dyadic sexual relationships, but my results did not show a significant positive correlation, nor were the results significant when tested separately for age, gender, and kink participation. Results of overall positive attitudes about kink and SM, however, can potentially lead to reduced stigma surrounding kink and SM communities, which then would hopefully lead to kink identifying individuals experiencing fewer social sanctions, less condemnation, and less discrimination due to their identities.
For mine, the results were found to be significant difference. Further research could narrow down what the actual cause is, because the exploratory results did not show any significant difference showing on to indicate what exactly causes the significant difference. And possible areas to focus on include cultural differences, since due to how we posted, it was largely, we have no clue to know how culture was involved. And just in general, the normalization of BDSM in media has changed a lot since a lot of the surveys used in the research were conducted. And limitations, there were sample size issues. There was an uneven split between participants used of LGBTQ people and heterosexual, and the LGBT group was combined instead of being able to look at each individual sexuality. Limited the options of how we could use the data for research purposes. And in conclusion, LGBTQ people are more accepting of sadomasochism than heterosexual people, but interestingly, still the heterosexual participants still had on the whole positive attitudes. And just acceptance of sadomasochism could also benefit LGBTQ people because there has been that interaction, one helping the other, and there's a lot of crossover in the gaps. And just more acceptance could lead to less social difficulties.
Okay, for my part, the implications for future research, I found that my study contradicted previous research on religious views on sexuality, because if the idea that sex is not for pleasure was upheld, then my results would have shown a strong negative correlation between religiosity and positive attitudes towards sadomasochism, which I did not find. However, I think that future research should focus more heavily on whether or not religiosity and marital status has an effect on attitudes about sadomasochism, because for a lot of religions, whether or not someone is married has a lot to do with what sexual acts they participate in. And then my biggest limitation for my study was that 78.3% of the sample population identified themselves as having no religious affiliation. And I feel that this is the biggest reason why I did not find stronger correlations. Okay, and the results of the ideology subscale may help reduce the negative stigma about sexual kink, because this goes to show that even people who are religious can have positive attitudes about sadomasochism. And this may help professionals such as sex therapists be more equipped to help clients who struggle with their sexual desires to participate in sadomasochism while also having religious beliefs. And then, just in conclusion, I hoped to find a relationship between religiosity and attitudes about sexual kink, but the results did not really support my hypothesis because I didn't find any significant correlations. But I still feel that this study is important because it's one of the first studies to examine religion and sexual kink.
For mine, I suggest that there be further analysis on gender and attitudes towards sadomasochism, because it could initiate a more gender-biased presumption and how it may relate to self-stigma and depression. And further analysis on stigma against sexual minorities would be beneficial to bring to light disadvantages and mistreatments that they may face in their everyday lives as well. Limitations within my research, as previously stated before, was definitely the small sample size, which just makes it harder to generalize the data that was collected. And the study also consisted primarily of white or Caucasian individuals with lower percentages of colored individuals. So again, makes it hard to really generalize the data that was gathered. The present study's finding can help reduce stigmas found in sexual minority populations, as they face much discrimination and are real targets of violence. And although research regarding kink is relatively new, further research could bring to light the disadvantages and mistreatments that they may face, whether it's from their jobs or health communities. In conclusion, there was no significant correlation among participants who did or did not engage in kink, as it relates to having more negative or positive attitudes in correlation to depression. And I believe that further research is important to conduct because we could find ways to stop the discrimination among sexual minorities as a whole within our society.
And then here are our references.